Today, myself, Michael, Zara and Talia will be presenting to you a report in regards to in vitro fertilisation, or as it is more commonly referred to, IVF. It's important for the audience to take note that a fetus is in fact classed as a human from fertilisation. Today we are discussing one of the most controversial topics of debate according to Kilman and Jenko 2012, that is IVF. But what is IVF? IVF is an abbreviation for in vitro fertilisation. As defined by Oxford's Concise Medical Dictionary, in vitro fertilisation is a fertilisation of an ovum outside of the body. The resultant zygote being incubated to the blastocyst stage and then implanted in the uterus. IVF can prevent defective genes being present in the fetus, therefore allowing them to avoid any diseases or disabilities that their parents may pass down onto them. In Jones's 2003 journal article, it became clear that the first ever attempt at IVF was conducted in 1965 by Robert Edwards and John Hopkins, as they attempted to fertilise human oocytes outside of the human body. However, this attempt was unsuccessful. Jones further made it clear that the first successful attempt was actually conducted in 1978 by Edwards and Steptoe. Today, IVF is used by a large number of different people all around the world. One of the greatest perks of IVF is that it allows individuals to conceive a child who in normal circumstances wouldn't be able to. As pointed out by Colin and Ledger 2008, IVF is used by those who are infertile. It allows these infertile individuals to play a role in their child's genes. As well as this, IVF is also used by same-sex couples who obviously are not able to naturally conceive a child. However, when such a topic is brought up, a lot of questions come to mind. Does this miracle of IVF outweigh the dangers? Is IVF creating negative stigmas for those with a disability? Are we trying to create a superior race? As a collective, we are against IVF. We believe it is a gateway and opening to creating a perfect race. In doing so, it begins to question the quality of life of individuals who do already have a disability or disease. IVF should not be used as an initial form of conception when trying to manipulate or avoid defected or diseased genes. As a group, we've come up with 3 arguments as to why. Michael, who will be appearing shortly, will discuss the debate of IVF versus abortion. He will raise a question on whether or not it's okay to abort a fetus if it's known that they'll have a disability or disease, and then later use IVF as a way to avoid such genes. As well as this, Michael will also touch on how IVF is the beginning of creating a superior race. He will discuss how in the future IVF may be heavily relied on and become the primary option for conception in order to create a perfectly healthy child. Later on, we'll have Zara presenting our second argument. Zara will talk about how couples using IVF to manipulate genes and how the testing and selecting process of embryos is discriminatory. Ultimately, IVF is saying that some genetic traits are not worthy enough to be reproduced. This is creating great discrimination against those who have those genes. Furthermore, Zara will discuss how discarding the embryos is actually breaching the autonomous right of each embryo. Our third and final argument will be presented to you by Talia. Talia will also discuss how IVF is the pursuit of a perfect human race. However, she will take a slightly different approach in doing so. Talia will discuss the controversy of IVF and the selection of genes on religious grounds. She will bring to your attention how the discarding of embryos is actually the destruction of life, and as well as this, she will discuss how IVF interferes with the natural way of life. Throughout all these arguments, we aim to enlighten you on the flaws of IVF and bring to your attention the ways in which IVF breaches many bioethical principles.
Always the most controversial topics which are discussed over and over again, without a clear conclusion to make. So how does it debate 2 of the most morally disagreed with acts in modern medicine, being both in vitro fertilisation and abortion? The debate of IVF versus abortion becomes more extensive in particular scenarios. For example, if a baby in the womb is determined to be carrying a sick or disabling feature, is it important for us to then ask ourselves, should we abort this child and then use in vitro fertilisation in order to conceive a physically stable child? The answer is simple, no on both accounts. Stated at the beginning of the presentation, an embryo is to be considered a live human from fertilisation, and thus any act of abortion on the fetus is an act of murder, and more so, a blatant disregard and lack of respect for the ethical principle of non-maleficence. The viewpoint of abortion is supported by an opinion developed with the rise of Christianity, in which the idea and act of abortion became equated with murder. Henceforth demonstrating that the relationship between abortion and murder does not exist without support. as demonstrated by George Bush in his 1988 presidential campaign, in which he treaded the possibility of criminalising women and or doctors who consider or perform abortions, as from Rosenbluth in 1993. Now, while it would be naive to comprise the same consequences for murder as a mother considering a termination of pregnancy, the same ethical and social issues are raised. The most prominent of which being the unborn child's right to live and their own personal quality of life. Challen 1994 stated, "The multidimensionality of quality of life refers to the coverage of a broad range of content, including physical, functional, emotional, and social well-being." This notion of multidimensionality demonstrates the excessive reasoning and rights of any human, including an undeveloped fetus. Yet even if the option of abortion is disregarded by a family, the option of IVF is still available. Imagine a scenario in which said family decide to keep the child due to their moral views of quality life and their distinct views against abortion. Do they have an aptitude to believe that if they were to have a second child, IVF is a morally just way to ensure a safe birth and avoidance of potential dangers and diseases? While they have a right to believe this theory, the act itself holds just as many ethical issues as abortion does. If it were guaranteed that IVF could create perfect, healthy babies for a larger proportion of the time, it would generate three serious problems that occur only once a reliance on IVF has fostered. This reliance would be an expected trend if permission was given to just use IVF as a primary option for conception to avoid potential health issues, some which can be incredibly insubstantial and can lead to the mindless pursuit of a perfect race. So what are these three serious issues? The first is resources. How can micro-allocation of scarce resources ensure a just healthcare scheme, in which excessive demand is placed on the population to provide donated sperm and eggs in order to facilitate the expanded IVF sector? Not to mention the allocation of staff, operating equipment and storage facilities to ensure that the IVF babies are fostered in a safe, secure and efficient facility environment. Dr. Ahmed Shaheen, 2007, demonstrated the knowledge that there are incompetent financial and health resources in developing countries that act as a major hindrance to infertility administration. This increased requirement for resources leads into the second issue associated with IVF reliance, and that is the impact of increases in surgical procedures and its increased costs. If parents were given the option to apply for government subsidised IVF processes for every conception, the relating tax requirements would grow exponentially, ensuring a direct impact on the hip pocket of Australian taxpayers. It is near impossible to support a movement such as using IVF as a safe birth procedure when the negative impact in terms of taxpayer dollars and constant requirements of resources lead to a mere 22.4% of live births on average per IVF procedure. Although IVF provides such minimal success rates, many disagree with the above statement and support the service. The opinion has been offered that modern-day fertility clinics offer a sense of genuine hope to 1 in 6 Australian families who require fertility assistance. Although this argument regarding the importance of IVF raises the procedure's requirement in modern society, counter-arguments reflecting our original views have been developed regarding the natural or God-given way to conceive a child, along with the complications with IVF procedures. For example, IVF and its impact on the masculinity of the father and the perspective of fatherhood as per Thursby and Gill 2004, given to a man overshadowed by the notion of an absent father. While the argument is continuous, arguments from both sides have been developed discussing the viability of IVF as an alternative to sexual conception. And most alarming issue is that of discarding unwanted embryos. In an IVF lab, careful watch of embryos is a common procedure, and if identified after several days that embryonic development has been mitigated, then the embryo is discarded. Let me put this in a real life scenario. James is an 8-year-old boy who gets his height measured by his parents once a week. At week 1, James stands at 145 centimetres. At week 2, he is once again measured at 145 centimetres, and week 3, the same again. James's development has been 0 in the previous 3 weeks, so his parents decide to kill James and discard his body in the bin. This is such an awful scenario to even think about, yet it happens numerous times a day in IVF clinics. So what merit does the autonomous right of the embryo hold as a human identity? The argument has been constructed that in the past, numerous studies on fetuses, infants, children, and adults have occurred with the absence of consent and has been considered tolerable. Flaws in this argument have been identified and rebutted by counter-views of McKenney, who demonstrated that difficulty associated with understanding the interests of an embryo, and thus the blatant disregard to informed consent overseen in Robertson's previous argument, thus touching on and expressing the unfeasible nature by which gaining the interests of an insentient identity. Third and most alarming issue is that of the discarding of unwanted embryos. In an IVF lab, careful watch of the embryos is a common procedure, and if identified after several days that the embryonic development has been mitigated, then the embryo is discarded. Let me put this in a real-life scenario. James is an 8-year-old boy who gets his height measured by his parents once a week. At week 1, James stands at 145 centimetres, and week 2, he is once again measured at 145. Week 3 comes and he is measured at the same height once more. James's development has been 0 in the previous 3 weeks, so his parents decide to kill James and discard his body in the bin. This is such an awful scenario to even think about, yet it happens numerous times a day in IVF clinics. What merit does the autonomous right of the embryo hold as a human identity? The argument has been constructed that in the past numerous studies on fetuses, infants, children, and adults have occurred with the absence of consent, and has been considered tolerable, as per Robertson 1995. Flaws in this argument have been identified and rebutted by counter-views of McKenney 2009, who demonstrated the difficulty associated with understanding the interests of an embryo, and thus the blatant disregard to informed consent overseen in Robertson's argument, thus touching on and expressing the unfeasible nature by which gaining the interest of an insentient entity. So to build on the IVF debate, and more so a continuation of my argument regarding the use of in vitro fertilisation to overcome potential illnesses or health hazards, I will now pass over to fellow La Trobe student Zeta Osbelli.
Human beings, our ability to understand and excel in matters concerning the natural way of life will be forever ongoing. IVF is one of the most controversial topics debated since 1978, and people still question whether this treatment's benefit outweighs its harm and underestimates the morality of such treatment. Couples wanting to avoid having a child with a genetic disease through a process of IVF raise the question whether manipulating genes to avoid disadvantaged or diseased embryos should be used to create a child. The answer is no. National Health and Medical Research Council aims to promote the development and maintenance of public and individual health standards. NHMRC takes into consideration the testing and selecting of human embryos as being reproductively discriminatory. This means that an individual is chosen not to be conceived as their genetic trait is not suitable to be reproduced. According to the NHMRC's guidelines, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is only permitted to be used to prevent the unborn child from being harmed by a certain disease or illness. This diagnosis will show if a child will be born with a condition such as Edwards syndrome or Tay-Sachs disease. Using IVF as an alternative for conception to prevent children being born with a disability should not be a choice. In the UK show, over the past 14 years, over half of the total number of embryos created for the use of IVF has not been used. Throwing out or using embryos for experiments only questions the autonomous right for each embryo discarded or destroyed by research. Studies conducted at the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority showed that for every one live birth, 32 embryos were created. As Lord Alton said, "We are creating and destroying human embryos on an industrial scale. I personally call that a tragedy, not a win for technology." The International Committee Monitoring Assisted Reproductive Technologies estimates 5 million children have been born using IVF since 1978. Imagine how many lives have been created, then lost, discarded, or frozen. A lesbian couple in the US have provoked strong criticism by deliberately choosing to have a deaf baby. When Sharon and Candy began searching for a donor suffering from congenital deafness, they were turned down by a number of sperm banks. This couple's action is not morally justifiable. This case involved pre-implantation where embryos were identified as fetal diseased, which enabled parents to choose between a deaf child or a hearing child. household is incredibly selfish. Surely such action by parents would be unjustifiable and be more of a moral harm than morally defensible. Using IVF to deliberately create a deaf child would deny that child's right to an open future. Deaf parents may believe that they are giving their child a better quality of life, but by doing this, they are removing the child's right to decide in whether or not being deaf would increase their quality of life. By purposely having a deaf child, you are taking away future autonomy. The autonomous right of the unconceived child should be given a chance, rather than being ignored and IVF being used. A lesbian couple in the US have provoked strong criticism by deliberately choosing to have a deaf baby. When Sharon and Candy began searching for a donor suffering from congenital deafness, they were turned down by a number of sperm banks. This couple's action is not morally justifiable. This case involved pre-implantation, where embryos were identified as faulty or diseased, which enabled parents to choose between a deaf child or a hearing child. President of the Family Research Council, also criticises the deliberate attempt to create a deaf child. Connor states, to intentionally give a child a disability, in addition to all the disadvantages that come as a result of being raised in a homosexual household, is incredibly selfish. Surely such action by parents would be unjustifiable, and be more of a moral harm than morally defensible. Using IVF to deliberately create a deaf child would deny the child's right to an open future. Parents may believe that they are giving their child a better quality of life, but by doing this they are removing the child's autonomous right and whether or not being deaf would increase their quality of life. By purposely having a deaf child, you are taking away future autonomy. The autonomous right of the unconceived child should be given a chance, rather than being ignored and allowing the process of IVF. Embryos that are diseased or disadvantaged instead of giving them a chance can alleviate the process of evolution and the hand of God, which Talia Sadekaya will discuss in further detail.
We live at a time of multiple revolutions in science, particularly medical science and technology. Profound innovations are emerging that will not only alter the problems we address or the way we respond to problems, but which may transform the sorts of creatures that we are. Our species may be changed for the better or worse by ways and prospects. The nature of human species is therefore at stake. There are some 1 million people for whom their journey towards personhood began when a fertility specialist peering through a microscope carefully added a sperm to an egg in a glass petri dish, a process known as in vitro fertilization. There have also been very dramatic improvements in our scientific understanding of genetic alterations associated with diseases and other inherited characteristics. This article was published, How Old is Too Old to Have a Baby, which reports that recently a 66-year-old woman gave birth to her child in Romania with help from her doctor, as she was told that she was too old to create her own eggs. An egg was fertilized and placed into her uterus. She will be 80 when her daughter is in high school. Possibly be pushing the bioethical viewpoint. Nonetheless, where do we draw the line? Do we allow 100 years or maybe even decades from now for parents to create their own children by choosing the desirable phenotypes such as the eye color, hair color, intelligence and strength through simply the process of selection and rejection of genes? From an evolutionary perspective, this process of IVF may be disturbing the work of natural selection and could alter, even possibly completely stop the process of human evolution, for it will disallow mutations in the pursuit of the perfect child. Fertilization has been controversial on religious grounds since their inception, but nonetheless within Islam, Judaism, Hinduism and most forms of Christianity, changes have been made to facilitate the fertility of the believers. An online journal article written by Bangri claims that Catholicism remains the only major world religion that unequivocally condemns the use of IVF. The Vatican Church contends that the research, development and the practice of IVF involve the destruction of embryos, that is, the destruction of human life. By engaging in assisted reproduction, humans are technologically interfering with a process that should remain under God's power. The Catholic Church, surrogacy, artificial insemination by husband or donor, and IVF are not allowed because procreation without sexual union is considered unnatural, and the Church has been quite vocal about its criticism. Church considers IVF wrong because it separates human procreation from morality union. In the process, couples make themselves masters of human life instead of its agents. The strongest protest is on the use of these supernumerary embryos in research, which hamper the dignity and dignity of human life. I'm considered to call the breed of a superior race.
Now, have we heard of that sort of talk before? How can we already forget what the Second World War was fought over? Yes, that's right, the monstrosity of the Nazi program took place. Did we so readily forget what the aims were of the Nazis? Well, let me remind you. Adolf Hitler wanted to create a master race, a race of superior beings. He wanted to breed a superior race, the Aryans, while weeding out inferior races. Thus, a combination of eugenics, selective breeding, natural selection, mass killings, and compulsory sterilization was used to create this master class. The whole world knows or should know about the horrors of such a vision. If this notion of the perfect race became an available alteration, the rules for competition would drastically change, and in doing so will eliminate individuality. Imagine the world as only beautiful people. Everywhere you look is a Cindy Crawford lookalike, 5'9", brown hair, brown eyes, and a terrific smile. This might seem appealing to some of you, but if we were all a clone of one another, what is the point in that? By creating these perfect humans, there will be no unique features of the human race. Everyone will look and be virtually identical, and there will be no element of surprise in life. Using gene modification, IVF, may help a lot of people live out happier and healthier lives. But really, is this helping evolution? Don't you think it's playing the role of God and eliminating the unique qualities each of us possess? Many people wonder where we are all going with all of the technological advances in medicine, and are we perhaps becoming too smart for our own good?
As mentioned earlier, IVF should not be used as an initial form of conception when trying to avoid diseases or disabilities. As we've argued all throughout the video, IVF is nothing but a pursuit for a perfect race. This pursuit for a perfect race is actually discriminatory against those with disabilities and diseases. IVF creates a negative stigmatism towards those with disabilities or diseases. IVF is basically saying such people with disabilities and diseases are not worth being reproduced, therefore questioning the quality of the lives of those who have a disability or disease. Many embryos, or lives if you'd like to put it, are discarded throughout the selection process of IVF. Lastly, in many religions, IVF is viewed as being wrong, as it goes against the natural way of life when conceiving a child. As a group, we recommend that children should be conceived naturally rather than in a science lab. We also strongly believe that IVF should not be used in order to facilitate the creation of children with hand-picked traits. We think, rather than focusing on eliminating diseased and defective genes, we should spend our time and money on promoting positive stigmas for diseases and disabilities, as well as providing education to the community on such diseases and disabilities. This brings us to the end of our presentation. For over 30 years, IVF has been greatly debated and will continue to be debated for many more years to come. It is one of the most controversial topics and has so many positives and negatives to it. So I'm going to leave you with some questions to think about. Is IVF wrong because it isn't the natural way to conceive a child? Does IVF create negative stigmatisms for those with disabilities? IVF lead to the desire to create a perfect race? Where and how do we draw the line with gene selection? If we can choose to eliminate defected and diseased genes, what's to say that we can't start choosing the eye colour and other physical features of our children? Thank you.